You'll see a little notice that we're doing that. And what we do is we train coaches, leadership development professionals on the Shift Positive method.
I have my headphones in
And,
and I'm doing a webinar in case anybody, I don't know if I'm not paying attention.
and if you have opportunity to mute yourself, that would be great. So we do training for leaders. We do a different approach to 360s that we're going to talk a little bit about. And we do manager workshops, staff training, team facilitation, and we actually work with organizations as they try to change.
Pete, you muted yourself.
There we go. I think we're back. So a little bit about some of the partners, some of the people that are active in our organization to bring this into organizations, and then some of the organizations that we work with, have worked with, and help out in this respect to bring more of a respectful and psychologically safe environment for feedback. Well, why is this? Why is feedback something that we focus on? And it doesn't take a lot to understand that feedback can be hard. Almost everybody's had a bad experience with feedback. And in looking at the research, more than a third of feedback interventions actually lead to poor performance and broken relationships. And that's the exact opposite of why it is that we bring feedback into organizations. We want people to be their best, to learn, to grow. And yet it doesn't work that way so well. My background is in the field of human resources and 20 years doing that. And it led me to want to fix what had been troubling, this feedback idea, when I came across this research that showed that it really doesn't work very well. And I had to ask myself, why is that? What is it that leads to feedback being broken? And what we find is that it's not due to poor intention. We want people to learn and grow and be their best selves, but it's broken for a couple of reasons, I believe. One, because of design failures, and the other because of delivery failures. From the design standpoint, first of all, feedback oftentimes is tied to possible promotion or a raise, and that compromises intent. People wonder, well, what is this for? Who's going to be reading my feedback? How is that going to be taken? What's the impact of the person I'm providing feedback on? And almost always confidential feedback is delivered in a confidential way. And therefore the feedback loses tone, context, and we have a negativity bias, so we tend to read feedback in a more harsh way than oftentimes the way in which it's shared with us or intended to be shared with us. It's almost always focused on what's not working, or even if it's surrounded by really good stuff, we tend to pay more attention to what we see as weaknesses, the thing that we want to fix that's always kind of been a failure for us. And it almost always feels like we're in it alone. It lacks ongoing support. Is there anything that happens after the feedback? Any follow-up, any plan that's put in place, any tracking of progress? So that leaves people feeling unclear, discouraged, isolated, as if their colleagues are against them rather than with them. Second area is about delivery. And with delivery, what Tom Rath found in his research on employee engagement is that the actively disengaged are individuals who say that only 1% of them report that they received any sort of feedback on their strengths. That rises to 22% of the actively disengaged say that they receive feedback on their weaknesses. And so the question is, where do they actively disengage come from? What do they report? The majority of them report that they didn't receive any feedback at all. So this idea that no news is good news is simply wrong. And because we don't know how to say something that can be hard, it leads us to not have the conversation. So all too often feedback isn't happening, and when it is, it's done poorly. So the Shift Positive approach is different. Shift Positive approach, as compared to the traditional feedback is focused on strengths and weaknesses, or quote opportunities, whereas the Shift Positive approach is really just focused on strengths. Instead of detailing what's not working, we build on success of what's happened well in the past. Instead of identifying what to do less of, we want to identify what they do more of. What would that look like? What would you see? And oftentimes that feedback comes to us, especially if it's confidential, without that context. But here we're focused on specific context and behaviors and solutions rather than problems. What would it look like? What would you see? Building toward a desired future of the relationship between you and that person together. And in that way, then it creates a two-way accountability rather than one-way feedback, where somebody simply takes a survey or is part of an interview, but then they go on with their day. And when we teach people how to do feedback well, it no longer needs to be confidential. In fact, those stakeholders now become allies, and they report that I could tell them this myself. I just didn't know how. And that's what we want to teach you today, is how to go further, how to get to that constructive feedback. If you were part of our webinar last month, we talked about this overall. We talked about a simple approach of focusing on strengths and then growth and then allyship. Those three core components. The Shift Positive approach is based on positive psychology and social support. And within that, looking at the strengths, growth, and allyship, and how do we build that? What we're going to do today is actually dive deeper into that second aspect, this solution focus, this growth aspect, and really do some practice around that. So you would have heard me say last time that this is a tree. We're now talking about the growth. We've talked about strengths before. Here we want to focus on growth. And this is a tree. This is not a mushroom cloud. This is not the opportunity to really blow somebody up and say what's not working, what isn't effective. And so we want to teach you how to go about doing that. But first, let me give you a little bit of an overview of what I think are some crucial feedback skills to develop. If you want to get good at feedback, these are some things to keep in mind. How do I move from weaknesses to really identifying and talking about strengths? How do I go from general concepts like leadership or communication or delegation or executive presence to specific behaviors? How do we reframe from problems and seeing what isn't working to solutions, what we'd want instead? How do we go from past failures, past things that aren't working, to future focus what it is that we do want? And then this one, instead of thinking, oh, I'm just going to treat everybody the same, how do we come to understand that feedback is relative and relational to the person providing it? And so I need to be versatile. I need to understand what works for them, because what works for the board chair is not going to be the same as what works for the CEO's, one of their direct reports. Different people need different things from that individual. And the more you understand what people are looking for from you, the more you can be versatile so that you can put them at ease and you can be successful, effective together. And in doing this, we want to move from stakeholders to allies. We're not providing feedback, but we're actually getting engaged in their professional development and making a commitment to them. And therefore, we're moving from it being confidential to it being transparent. So out of those skills, today's webinar is really focused on these two. How do we reframe from general concepts to specific behaviors? And how do we reframe from problems to solutions? We just want to work on those two key skills today. And we'll be covering other ones in future webinars, or you'll find it on our website in articles and videos and things like that. So oftentimes when we're dealing with feedback, when we're approaching feedback, we're thinking about strengths. What is it that you love about this individual? We start there with the strengths. And then generally, what do we do next? We ask about weaknesses, or we soften the language and we ask about, quote, opportunities. But I want you to consider this. Don't do that. Instead, how about not asking about weaknesses at all? They might be interesting, informative, insightful, but they're insufficient to make change. And what I mean by that is that we need to go further. We need to understand, what could they do instead? And that's kind of provocative. Why not say the weaknesses? They can take it, radical candor, all those kinds of things. We should have that culture where we can just be straight with each other. Well, that's a nice idea, but that ignores something around our physiology, our biology, how our brain works in terms of the brainstem, the amygdala, before you get to the prefrontal cortex. We're on alert for any sort of threat. So instead, what we want to do, certainly if you've got great relationship with that individual and you have that relationship where it's like, hey, just tell me the way it is, because I trust that you've got my best intention in mind, then you can do that. Oftentimes, though, you find yourself in feedback situations where that's not the case. So if we stop with, if we talk about the problem, if we stop there, it shuts people down. Instead, we want to do some work, and that is to identify what you want instead. And this isn't just about being fluffy or positive, but we want to instead build that ability to be constructive. And that takes work by the feedback provider to go further, to identify what they do want, what it would look like. Otherwise, the person that's receiving the feedback will simply know what not to do, but that doesn't help them move forward and develop toward what would make them more effective. So to do this, to move from weaknesses to solutions, we need to overcome our biology, this negativity bias. We're on alert for potential threats. And so it takes this work to identify what do we want instead from that other individual. And frankly, having done this thousands of times, when asking people, what do you want? The answer is that they don't know because they haven't thought it through. So that's what we're going to be working on here. Where does this come from? By background in the area of coaching and therapy, there's been a lot of experiments around problem-focused approaches or solution-focused approaches. And so Tony Grant is one of the leading researchers in this area to look at if you group people, put them into experimental groups, and with one group you use a problem-focused approach, and with another group you use a solution-focused approach, which ones have better outcomes? So the problem-focused approach is to be asking about the problem, to be digging into it with questions like, how long has it been a problem? When did it start? What are your thoughts about it? How do you react to those thoughts? What impact does it have? What do you think that you would do? The solution-focused approach is different. It doesn't go into the problem whatsoever. It just says, okay, so think about a solution. And even borrowing from David Cooperrider with the magic question, imagine that it magically came about. What would that look like? What would you see? Describe it. How could you start? How does that feel? We tend to think that you have to understand and dissect the problem in order to come to a solution. And what we find is that you don't. That actually the outcome of this research shows that those individuals, they had an increase in their goal approach, increased positive affect in going after that, decreased negative affect, increased self-efficacy, believing, not self-esteem, but self-efficacy, believing that I'm capable of doing this. I know how to do this now. And then significantly more action steps toward reaching that goal. They actually had better outcomes because they were in that positive affect, which makes them more creative. They visually have greater peripheral vision. They see more, they think more creatively, and they come up with better solutions in which to pursue, and then they've got the energy to pursue those. So there's, I think, kind of a remarkable saying within this whole area of solution-focused coaching. The solution doesn't care why the problem occurred. Okay? You might want to dig into that, but you know what? You're still going to have to come back to the solution. And the solution really doesn't care why the problem occurred. Now, I say this a little bit with the idea that we're already good at problem solving. That's not a skill we need to develop a lot. We do that every day, all day long, and especially as you rise in organizations, you get better at problem solving. But you can build a different skill. You can build the skill of identifying solutions and then experiment yourself with just going to the solution. What would I want? What would it look like? And that's very important then when it comes to feedback. And part of it as well is the idea that no problem exists all the time. So taking a positive deviance approach, when is the problem not a problem? When have they excelled with their executive presence or with their communication, with their delegation, with their leadership? What did that look like? What would you want to see? This idea of coaches themselves, when we talk to coaches, the idea of, oh, where does this term coach even come from? It comes from the term coachman, the person that drove the coach. When you get into the coach, when you get into the cab, what do they ask you? Where to? They don't have to ask you where from, but they do need to ask you where to. And that's what we're doing, is focusing on where to. What do you want? What would you see? So you've maybe seen this before. I'm going to show you a quick little video here.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So how many of you saw the moonwalking bear? Andrew did not see the moonwalking bear. Jan did not see the moonwalking bear. Okay. So oftentimes people on a call like this have even used this video before, and sometimes they still miss the moonwalking bear.
How many
So then
How many?
here's another quiz for you. How many branches are on this tree? The answer is a lot. There's a lot of branches on this tree. Okay. Yeah. I like how people lean in and start counting. That's very cute. So now how many faces are on this tree? People are leaning in even more. 5, 6, there's about 11 to 13 faces on this tree. Here. If you can see my cursor, can you see my cursor, Andrew? Here, the little czar person up here. Here's the little spooky baby looking up, scary baby face. So Halloween. So this is something called inattentional blindness or change blindness. We don't see what we're not looking for. If I ask you to see faces, if I ask you to see branches, you see branches. If I ask you to count the basketballs, you count the basketballs. You don't see faces until we bring your attention to the faces. And then once you start seeing faces, it's hard to look at this and not see faces. This is about inattentional blindness and priming. Some of the systems design failures that we have is that we ask people what's not working. What do you want them to change? What's broken? And we don't go a step further and say, what do you want instead, until they can see it in their mind's eye so that they can see it when it happens. So we need to move past this inattentional blindness, because unless you take the time to truly think about what success looks like, the person is going to be guessing, and you won't recognize the change in that individual when it starts to happen because you haven't seen it yet. So if you say greater leadership, better communication, more delegation, if you don't know what that means to you, and if you can't convey it, they won't know what to do, and you won't notice it when it happens. And that's why it can be tough as a coach working with leaders when the environment they're going back to does not recognize the changes that the person's trying to make. They don't know what they're trying to do differently in behavioral detail until they don't recognize it. As Jessa Mordegi, another coach, talks about, she said, it's like putting a cucumber in a jar of vinegar and expecting it not to become a pickle. So we need to affect that environment around the individual. What is it that we're trying to build? So it can be very hard to do less of a bad behavior. Instead, we need to build toward what is the desired behavior? What would you see? What would that be like? All right. So how do we do that? Well, in the chat, there's going to be a T-chart that looks like this, and Andrew's going to repost it there, I believe. And this is a simple way to move from that problem focus to solution focus. So on this left-hand side, here's feedback that one of my clients received. Needs to be involved in everything, gets lost in the details, doesn't trust his team, is slow to make decisions. Okay. Know anybody like that? Well, so if you provide that feedback, what's going to happen? They're going to know what people don't appreciate about them. They're going to say, I've been working on that forever. I don't know how to do it. And when they start to try those changes, they're going to wonder who said that. That's the absolute first question that comes to mind. Who said that? So what we do is we work to go further. If somebody brings that up, it's like, okay, fine. What would they do instead? What would you see? Well, when an issue comes up, they'd think about who, not how. They wouldn't hang on to it, but instead, the first thing that would go through their mind is, who should I give this to? They'd share what will give them confidence that I've got it. They'd tell me what will raise their confidence. They'd be clear about who's doing it and by when. Who clear is kind, the Brene Brown saying. And they'd ask about our thinking rather than the details. Tell me how you're thinking about that issue. Don't tell me exactly what you're going to do. Okay. These are things that my client can do. And that's actionable. That's stuff that then those individuals are going to see because they've already seen it in their mind's eye. They've seen the solutions to what's bugging them. They've gone further to identify what they want rather than what they don't. So I want you to do something then. I want you to think about somebody in your world, maybe a coworker, maybe it's somebody personal, and ask yourself, if they were even more effective, what would they be doing? What would that look like? What do you want them to do? And you can use the chart there if you would like, but I want you to next in that chart, or you can simply draw a big T on a piece of paper. On that left-hand side, what would they change? What would be different? What would they stop doing? What wouldn't they do? And then on the right-hand side, and I'll give you 4 or 5 minutes to do this, I want you to start writing down, what would they do instead? What would that look like? So if it's a problem focus, put it, or a weakness, put it on the left-hand side. If it's more solution-oriented, what they could do to be more effective, put it on the right-hand side. Try to get as clear as you can about that right-hand side. Maybe you only want to pick one thing from the left-hand side to get clear about on the right-hand side. Okay, so now if you have something written on the right-hand side that begins with stop, don't, wouldn't, won't, or other sorts of NTs like that, then you're not there yet. You need to keep working at it, okay? So now, here's the really fun part. I'm going to ask if there is somebody that would be willing to come off of mute and do a little demo with me. Who's brave in this group? Don't worry, I'll help you through it. Hi, Jan. Awesome.
Well, I'm brave. Stupid.
So tell me then, you don't have to say a lot about this individual, but what were some of the things on that left-hand side?
Yeah, this individual is bubbly and wonderful, but is way too, is very chatty and wants to be liked by the, because she's in HR. So as somebody new in this space, I think she, just is super chatty and not always productive in her work because she's trying to be well known by everybody.
Okay, so chatty, wants to be well known, HR person. And so what is it that you came up with on the right-hand side? What do you want to see instead?
What I'd love to see her think about how she would like to be described.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking, hopefully,
Okay.
because I know she wants to be viewed as a professional and all that. So help her create a personal vision.
Mhm.
And I would like for her to think about what value that she could bring to each conversation, because I don't want her to stop talking to people, but I think her conversations could be more work oriented.
Okay. So both of those began with think. You wanted her to think. Now, what would you actually see her doing then?
Okay, I would see her preparing a personal vision of how she would like to be described.
Okay.
I would like her to, again, I think it involves preparation until you make it habit, but to think about when I'm having day-to-day interactions with people, what value am I trying to bring to
Okay.
them?
And if you were watching her and you sensed that she was bringing more value, what would you notice in her in those conversations that she was having? Describe it.
I would overhear, because I can overhear them, more where she would be talking about their role or what they're working on or what their challenges are. Would the content would change
The content would be more about what?
more about our workplace and them as a team member and how we can help them. That's number one. Number two.
So they'd be talking more about the workplace, more about the work content in their interactions.
Correct.
Okay. What else?
That said, she would still retain her authenticity and her, general personality wouldn't.
Sure. So she'd
need to
still
go
be
away.
connecting with people. She'd still be kind of bubbly and positive, and
Sure,
but it would be
but
more
just a little more directed and focused.
directed and focused. And say a little bit more than about directed and focused. How else would you know that she's being directed and focused behaviorally?
Well, I'm trying to avoid the things I don't want to, but you could help me. I mean, because, you wouldn't hear so much chit chat about last night's television show or her own personal stuff. Kind of it oozes in, and it really shouldn't be about her. It should be about them.
Okay. Okay, good. Yep. And you're identifying already those kinds of things that are on that left-hand side, and you're trying to create what's on the right. So I'll keep helping.
Yeah.
So she'd be talking a little bit more about the work-related content. She'd still be connecting with people. What else would she maybe do that would show that shift?
Just think because she would now be gathering, she'd have a greater insight into people's roles or whatever. The shift that I probably would see is then in our team meetings, she now has a more strategic and deeper understanding of either our culture, our work process.
And what would
she
that
could
look like?
contribute. She'd be able to contribute in our team conversations by demonstrating a greater understanding of how people, the day-to-day challenges and opportunities that our employees face.
Okay. So she'd be, so not only would you overhear her talking more about the work itself and still connecting with people, but you would hear her in the team meetings talking about the challenges that employees are having.
Correct.
Okay. If that happened, would you notice?
Yes.
Good. So
it's very observable. You'd hear it. Yeah.
Fantastic, Jan. Thank you so much. Everybody, please applaud Jan for being, this is very brave. So what did you notice about Jan when she was working on that? Physically, her eyes were starting to go up. She was looking around like this. She was looking down to the left a little bit, and then she would come back with an answer. And
I still do that.
Yeah, everybody does that. That's what you look for when you're coaching somebody or trying to help somebody to get to that solution focus is they're looking to see it in their mind's eye. And once you get to that place where you see it in your mind's eye, then that question of, and if it happened, would you notice? It's like, yeah, I'd fall off my chair if that happened. Well, now it's pretty easy for me as a coach to talk with her and say, hey, some of the feedback would be, your conversations would be with individuals, you'd still be so warm and welcoming and bubbly and connecting, but it would also, the content would be about the work itself. So that then in the team meetings, you're able to contribute with, here's what's really affecting employees. Okay. That's pretty easy to say instead of, I want her to be thinking about this, or I want her to be less about the TV shows of the night and things like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So now what you observe in me through this process is probably the questions weren't that complex. What would it look like? What would you see? What would it look like? What would you see? When has it happened before? What did it look like? And that's what I mean by the person doesn't know until they go through the process so that they can see it in their mind's eye.
If I could just add, the biggest question I get from leaders is they will first start out by saying, I wish my person was more strategic. And then they turn to their person and say, in 2024, I really need you to be more strategic. And the person is like, I don't have a clue. I actually don't even know what that means. And number two, I have no idea where to start. So I just want to throw that in there, that's, the biggest discussion I've certainly entered into.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably the answer to that is they don't know until you ask them. For this individual that you just described, being more strategic was actually being able to convey what's going on in the day-to-day lives with employees. So strategic is a concept. Conveying what's going on in the day-to-day lives of employees during our staff meeting is a behavior. So that's what we're working toward. So what we want you to do then is give you an opportunity to practice this yourselves. So we're going to put you into rooms of 3. One of you is going to volunteer, as Jan did, to talk about your individual, and the other 2 are going to coach. And the way in which you coach that individual is simply asking some simple questions. What do you want them to do instead? What would that look like? What would you notice? What would you see? Has that happened before? What did it look like then? Okay. So we want to give you a chance to practice this. So we're going to give you 10 minutes to actually do that because it takes a little bit of time. If you have an opportunity to move to a second person, that's great. Go ahead and do that. But right now, we're going to have you connect with somebody else. And Angel, are our rooms set up there? Okay. You want to go ahead and open them up? And look for that physical cue in the individual that shows that they're starting to see it in their mind's eye. You want to come off of mute, Angel?
Yep, I am opening them now.
Okay.
Pete, you're muted.
How about now? So that was fun to go into one of the rooms and observe. What was it like then for you to be the coach, or excuse me, the client that was being asked the questions?
I'll share. It helped me to stop. It got me out of my emotion and got me more into thinking of what I really wanted to see and how I would notice
Mhm.
a change in the person.
There's a good point there that there is a lot of emotion with feedback. And so how do you help somebody through that? Through that emotional reaction, that negativity bias, to get to something constructive, something that they would want, that they would really appreciate. Anyone else about what it was like to be coached, to be the client? Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I had two great coaches, so I'm very grateful for both of them. And they asked really good questions. They were very good listeners. We had a short period of time conveying the story in a tight manner. And even though I thought, oh, I have all these positive behaviors, they got to a lot of even the willingness. Like, okay, I could see these behaviors. I'll know when it's changed, but I still could have been way off. Like, these are behaviors I want them to do, but is it even in the bank of strengths? And why should they care? So I loved it.
Good. How about to be the coach? What was it like to be coach?
It was hard. I found it hard. Here's where I struggled, Pete, was, and maybe just quick guidance. I know we don't have all the time in the world, but I still wanted to not dig into the why the problem existed, but I did want to give them a mirror and state that these are observations. And then, as Liz was saying, we did want to share the impact of what that had on other people and the team and the whole thing. Like, so why it matters. We felt we needed to infuse that, because otherwise we were moving to a punch list of solutions, and the person might look at you and go, that just seems like busy work. So is that accurate? That, I feel like you have to be willing to talk about the problem enough so that they get it, why we're talking about it, and help them see why it matters, because then a lot of times they could come up with some of their own little, ideas too, right? So tell me where I'm off base there.
Motivation matters. And so thinking about, why are you garnering feedback for an individual in the first place? What is their motivation to actually participate in that? Do they want to learn and grow? Is it part of just something that we do executive 360s, or is it something that a person is looking to grow? And I would say that a resource that I would recommend to you is actually a local expert, Kevin Wilde. Kevin Wilde wrote this book called Coachability, the Leadership Superpower. He was the chief. He was the person that headed up leadership development at General Mills for many, many years. And so fantastic resource. And he talks about the studies that they conducted there into who it is that actually takes in and acts on feedback. Those individuals that continue to grow in their roles, what is the one thing that they pay attention to? And it came down to one question. They value and they act on feedback. And so how is it that you assess whether a person is ready for feedback, if they've got motivation for it? And then what are some of those behaviors of people who receive feedback that succeed with it? So the way that we do it in 360s is that we go deep on the person that we're doing the 360 on about their motivation. Because if it's something light, fluffy about career advancement, stuff like that, it's not going to stick, especially if they're an experienced person and those behaviors have made them successful to this point. So you have to dig into what is it personally that's going to help you? Why are you going to keep trying when it would be easier to just do it the way you've always done it? So you're hitting on an important part that is about motivation, but that's also that emotional part that was talked about earlier in terms of, there's the emotion of wanting to give the feedback to say, in essence, this hurts. I need you to change this because this is hard for me. And by helping the person to get to what do you want instead? that's helpful. What I've learned in doing this is it's important to acknowledge the pain. At a group, a board where I was interviewing the board chair about the CEO and a nonprofit. And I kept asking, and what is it that you would want this next year? What would that look like? And he said, no, you need to understand. So it's the best year we ever had. And almost everybody on the board was ready to quit. And I had been continuing to ask him these solution-oriented questions. And so I paused for a second. And I said, wow, that sounds hard. He said, yeah, it was. So what would be happening this next year then? And then he was able to move there. Then he was able to get behind, well, I'd see this. This is how the governance committee would operate, how he'd interact with the governance committee and with the finance committee and so forth. So the emotions are an important part of it. Did that help at all, Jan?
Yes. Was for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Louisa, you have a question.
Yeah, just more on that line of emotions. What if you're very emotional about this feedback? You know, what if you're kind of really upset or this person is really frustrating you? Any tips on how to keep your emotions in check before you go into the feedback session?
And you being who? The client or the stakeholder or
The person giving the feedback.
person giving the feedback? Yeah. Yeah, it would be that same thing that I said about acknowledging that this can be hard. And at the same time, sometimes you need to challenge to be able to say, and yet, what's going to happen if we don't address this? And if we don't get to what you want rather than what you don't? Is what's going to give it a greater likelihood of change? If you can clearly identify what you want so that I can convey that to them, or you can convey that to them and give them the opportunity to make change. Sometimes some of the smallest changes are things like, see with leaders of, we'll have lunch together. We'll have a start over meeting. But I think acknowledging goes a fair way in my experience. And then also partnering that with a little bit of challenge.
Like you're acknowledging your own frustration, is that it? Or?
Acknowledging that stakeholder's frustration. That sounds hard. That must be difficult. What would make it better? What would you see? Angel, did you have something to add?
I was just going to ask, I wasn't sure if that was getting at Louisa's question. Were you asking about Louisa being the person providing the feedback to the coach? Pete, can you address it from that position, from the stakeholders position, from the allies position, who is offering the feedback to the coach?
Yeah, they're frustrated. That is how I was answering it.
Okay.
Was as the coach acknowledging that, and at the same time being able to challenge if need be able to point out what will help. This is an opportunity to get clear about what's going to make it better. What would that look like for you?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Malcolm.
Thank you. So in the breakout room, I was tag teamed by Francine and Joanna. Awesome experience. I was the coachee and it was insightful. I liked the 3 questions because they zoom into a specific area. Mm-hmm. We discussed a challenge I have with a coachee, and the result was insightful. However, I'm still not seeing how we can avoid dealing with the challenge, problem, whatever label we want to use. The result of that mini coaching session was a shift in behavior. So I got an insight of how to approach that situation with a coachee. However, it's dealing with change in behavior of the coachee. So could you help me better understand how we can avoid dealing with the current behavior by just zooming into the desired behavior?
Sure. So first, I want to acknowledge that we're at time here. So if anybody needs to leave, that's totally understandable. I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer and answer questions and so forth, but I don't want you to feel uncomfortable leaving if you need to leave. So yeah, Malcolm, this idea of don't we have to deal with the problem? That's a common response. That's a common reaction. And part of my response is experiment with it. experiment with, okay, what would you want? What would you see? What would that look like? And helping them to see it. Because if you lead with the this is what's not working and what they want to see instead, what you're doing is activating that negativity bias in the client. And it's very hard for them to listen past that, because they start putting it into the context of my relationship with that person, what they should be doing differently, why they should be acting differently, that part of this is their problem. And they aren't really able to take in and hear, all they're asking you to do is this, or what it would look like is this. Is that something that would be worthwhile if it's going to make you more effective in working with this person? So it comes from just the experience of doing it a lot of times. And then what you do find as well, if you're doing, for example, if you're doing this in a 360, is that ability and to say how important the issue is. Here's something, client, that came up a number of times. This would have a big impact for you, I believe, in your leadership if you were able to do this. This is going to move you ahead faster. So what I do is, instead of attributing it to specific people, I would look for an overarching theme like that at that point and say, here's something about empowerment that's a big deal. If you can empower people, show that you trust them by being clear about your delegation, being thinking through who, not how, and so forth, I think that's going to take you a long way. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, yes, it does. And I like the part that the focus in the initial focus is not on the problem, which triggers negative emotions and pushback. However, it's on possibility thinking. And maybe then we can circle back to that behavior that's not working.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it's even necessary.
Yes. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you all. It's wonderful to have you here. And the last thing that we'll put up here then are some of the resources that Andrew's been putting in the chat. So the kinds of things that we do, we train leadership development and coaching professionals in this approach, the Shift Positive 360, Shift Positive Live. We do training with leaders and managers on more constructive feedback. And if you're looking to have just a conversation, feel free to reach out. Or if you're looking for the content, then check out the book, Feedback Reimagined, that I wrote last year, that covers these concepts in more detail and is an easy read. So thank you for being with us. And I'll stick around even a little bit longer if anybody would like.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Joanna.
Pete, I was just wondering if